You know, when you think about any really big deal, like, say, building a major project or developing a property, it really is like a complex dance, isn't it?
It absolutely is. You've got multiple partners, intricate steps, and yeah, always that chance someone could stumble.
So what gives it structure? What provides that choreography, those steps that are meant to protect everyone involved?
Well, that's the contract, right? That's the fundamental blueprint. It's the legal framework that takes what everyone intends to do and turns it into solid, binding commitments.
It's what secures the money, the investments, the dreams, really.
Exactly. Huge amounts are often at stake.
So a handshake might get you started, but in these big, complex transactions, what is it that actually transforms that nod and agreement into something legally real, something binding?
It really comes down to the careful crafting of that document, the negotiation.
Which is exactly why we're doing this deep dive today. We're looking at some very practical source material,
Yeah.
specifically a guide that focuses on drafting construction contracts. And our mission, really, is to unpack the essentials. What are the key elements? What are the critical clauses you need to understand? The goal is to help you listening feel less like just a signer.
Just signing on the dotted line.
Right. And more like a contract conductor. Someone who gets the rhythm, understands the moves, and knows where the tricky parts, the risks, might be.
Yeah, understanding the music, not just holding the sheet. So let's dive into what this source material says about just the basic nature of putting these agreements together. It calls contract drafting and negotiation inherently a push and pull process.
That really resonates, doesn't it? Because, I mean, underneath it all, everyone involved has one key motivation:
Hmm.
manage their risk.
Absolutely. Whether that's trying to push risk down the line to someone else or limit their own exposure or just figure out who takes the hit if something goes wrong, risk is central.
It's all about controlling that potential downside.
Right. And the guide we looked at, it's got a very clear-eyed view on this. It says, look, there's no such thing as a perfect contract where one side just gets everything at once. They call that the great contract.
Kind of a mythical beast, then. And equally, there isn't usually a truly bad contract where the other side gets completely railroaded either.
Not in most functional deals, no. The reality, the source emphasizes, is the negotiated contract. It's what comes out of that back and forth. Ideally, the toughest points get discussed, understood, maybe modified through compromise. That push and pull is just fundamental.
Okay, so if the process is this push and pull, the main engine driving it is trying to control risk.
That's the core objective, yes. And the guide lays out some governing principles for how to think about controlling risk. First, it advises only assume reasonable risk.
Reasonable risk, what does that mean in practice?
Don't take on obligations or potential liabilities that are way out of proportion or things you just can't realistically handle.
Okay, that makes sense. Don't bite off more than you can chew, risk-wise. What's next?
Assume risk that you can control. If something falls within your scope of work, your expertise, you're probably the best party to manage the risks that come with it.
So take responsibility for your piece of the puzzle. And the third principle.
Make sure the whole deal, the overall project economics, isn't totally undermined because you took on some unreasonable risks. Winning the bid isn't everything if the contract terms could potentially sue you later.
Right, it's about winning a sustainable project, not just any project.
Mm-hmm.
And the source points out that the main way you actually do this, how you control risk, is through the contract language itself.
Exactly. By actively limiting your liability exposure where possible and being really clear about defining your specific obligations within that agreement.
So the words on the page are the tools.
Precisely. And that brings us to the nuts and bolts, the specific clauses inside the contract that are used to manage and divvy up that risk among everyone involved.
The clauses themselves.
And the guide highlights 6 common ones in construction contracts that it says really require negotiation specifically for risk control.
All right, let's list them out. So we've got pay if paid pay, when paid clauses.
Yep. Then indemnity provisions.
Okay. Liquidated damages clauses.
No damages for delay clauses.
Flow drain clauses.
And finally, material escalation clauses.
Wow, okay. That's quite a toolkit for trying to manage uncertainty. Let's maybe zoom in on a few of those using the examples from the source. What about those pay if paid, pay when, paid ones first? They sound similar.
They do sound similar, but the difference is actually huge, legally and practically. They both work to shift risk, but in slightly different ways with potentially big consequences.
How so?
They're basically designed to push the risk of the owner not paying the general contractor further down the chain. often from the GC down to the subcontractors and their suppliers.
So hang on, a sub could do their job perfectly, install everything right, but still not get paid just because the owner hasn't paid the GC.
That's exactly the risk being shifted. The sub might have absolutely no control over why the owner isn't paying the GC, but their own payment is suddenly tied to that upstream event. Now, the key legal difference, and this is critical, is often how courts interpret them. A pay-if. Paid clause is usually seen as a conditioned precedent, meaning payment to the sub is only due if the GC gets paid by the owner. If the owner never pays the GC, the obligation to pay the sub might just disappear. It's extinguished.
Seriously, that sounds harsh.
It can be. Now, a pay when paid clause is more often interpreted as being about the timing of payment. The GC still has to pay the sub eventually, but they can delay that payment until they get paid by the owner.
Okay, so if you get paid, pay. When paid is when you get paid. That's a massive difference for a subcontractor or supplier.
It's a night and day difference in terms of financial security. Obviously, these clauses are great for owners and GCs for cash flow and risk management, but they really limit the rights of those lower down the chain. It's interesting, the source does note this tension. It mentions that quite a few states are actually passing laws, prompt payment statutes, specifically to protect subs. And some of these laws explicitly make pay if paid clauses void because they're seen as against public policy, too unfair.
So state law stepping in to rebalance that risk. That seems like a recurring theme we might see. Okay, let's shift gears. Liquidated damages clauses. The guide gave a pretty specific structure for those.
It did. A typical phrasing might be something like, if the contractor breaches its obligation, say, misses the substantial completion date, contractor shall pay the owner X dollars per day for each day of delay as liquidated damages.
So a fixed daily rate for being late. Why do that? Why not just wait until the project's finished and figure out what the actual delay costs the owner?
Well, the rationale, as the source explains it, is that everyone agrees upfront that figuring out the actual financial losses from a delay can be inherently difficult.
How so?
Think about it. How do you precisely calculate the owner's lost rental income, or extended financing costs, or maybe the cost of keeping temporary facilities open longer, or just the ripple effects on their business? It can get incredibly complicated and lead to huge arguments and even litigation later.
Okay. So the liquidated damages amount is basically the parties trying to avoid that fight later by agreeing on a reasonable estimate now.
Exactly. The source is clear, though. It's meant to be a reasonable measure of estimated damages based on what they think the loss might be, using their experience or industry norms. It's not supposed to be a penalty.
What's the difference?
If the amount set is so high that it looks like you're just punishing the contractor rather than genuinely trying to pre-estimate the likely damages, a court might say, nope, that's an unenforceable penalty, and strike it down. But if it's reasonable, it provides cost certainty for both sides about what happens if there's a delay.
Got it. That reasonable measure versus penalty idea is key. Okay, next up, material escalation clauses. These seem incredibly relevant right now, with material prices being so volatile.
Absolutely critical, especially on longer projects where the price of steel or lumber or concrete could swing wildly between when you bid the job and when you actually need to buy the stuff. These clauses are specifically meant to deal with that price fluctuation risk.
So how do they work? How do parties usually structure them?
The source mentions a few common methods. One is to tie the baseline price of certain key materials to a published cost index. They give the example of using data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, like their national price info.
So you agree on a starting price, and then if the index goes up by the time you buy, the contract price adjusts accordingly.
That's the idea. It provides an objective way to measure the change. Another approach mentioned is simpler, just a direct comparison. You compare the actual invoice price the contractor paid for the materials against the price that was assumed in their original bid.
Are there ways to kind of fine-tune these clauses so you're not constantly adjusting for tiny changes?
Yes, absolutely. They often build in mechanisms like a minimum fluctuation threshold. For example, the price only gets adjusted if the cost increases by more than, say, 3% of the market price at the time of bid. It avoids fiddling around with tiny adjustments.
Okay. And what about on the high end? Are there caps?
Often, yes. You might see limits on the maximum adjustment, maybe capping the increase at 10% or tying it to a total percentage of the overall contract value. This gives the owner some protection against truly astronomical price spikes. So the clause helps manage the volatility, but it doesn't necessarily mean the owner is completely insulated from any price increase.
Right. It's about managing the risk of increase, not eliminating it entirely, making it predictable.
Exactly. And importantly, the source notes that to even qualify for an adjustment under these clauses, there are usually very specific notice procedures in the contract. You have to follow the rules, provide documentation on time. Communication is key.
Makes sense.
Oh, and contractors might also try to include language here, or maybe in a related clause, to limit their liability for project delays that are specifically caused by material delivery problems, separating the price risk from the schedule risk, if possible.
Okay, so we've hit on payment timing, delay costs, material prices.
Mm.
You also listed indemnity provisions earlier as being really crucial for risk control.
Yes, indemnity clauses are fundamental. They're core risk allocation tools. Basically, one party agrees to cover the losses, damages, or liabilities of another party under certain circumstances that are spelled out in the contract.
So like one party agrees to pay the other party's legal bills or damages if a certain thing happens.
Essentially, yes, it's about shifting who ultimately bears the financial responsibility if a defined risk materializes, like a lawsuit or property damage.
Can you give an example? Like maybe if a subcontractor's work leads to an injury claim?
That's a classic one. The subcontract might require the subcontractor to indemnify, meaning protect and pay for, the general contractor and maybe even the owner against any claims arising from the sub's negligence or work. They are always heavily negotiated.
But here's the kicker, right? You mentioned state law variation earlier.
Exactly. And this is where it gets really complex and, frankly, critical to understand. The enforceability and the actual scope of what an indemnity clause can cover are not the same everywhere in the U.S. state laws, very dramatically.
So just because you have an indemnity clause written one way in your contract doesn't automatically mean it works that way.
It absolutely does not. This is where knowing the specific state law that governs your contract is non-negotiable. The source we looked at even includes a table just to illustrate this complexity.
What kind of variations are we talking about?
Well, for instance, many states have anti-indemnity statutes. Some of these say you cannot be indemnified for your own sole negligence. If you were 100% at fault for the problem, you can't use the contract to force someone else to pay for your mistake.
Okay, that seems somewhat fair.
Other states go even further. They might bar indemnity even for partial negligence, meaning if you were, say, 20% responsible for an issue, you can't be indemnified for that 20% share of the blame, even if the contract seems to say you can.
Wow, so the exact same words in a contract could mean you're fully covered in state A, but only partially covered, or maybe not covered at all for certain things, in state B.
Precisely. It's not just a minor legal technicality. It fundamentally changes who pays potentially very large sums of money when something goes wrong, purely based on the project's location and the governing law specified in the contract.
That really underscores the need to, well, to not just use boilerplate language.
Definitely not. And some states also have very specific rules about how indemnity interacts with insurance requirements, like being named as an additional insured on someone else's policy. It gets layered and complex. You absolutely have to verify enforceability under the specific state law for your project.
That variation alone is just. It's a huge reason to read every word and know the rules of the road for where you are.
It really is. Contract language never exists in a vacuum. It's always interacting with the laws of the place where the work happens or the contract is managed.
Okay, let's try and pull this all together then.
Sounds good.
So we've established that any significant project, any big deal, is built on the foundation of a contract. And getting to that contract involves this push and pull negotiation.
Right. Driven mostly by everyone trying to manage their risk exposure, following principles like sticking to reasonable risks, controllable risks, and making sure the risks you take don't just sink the whole venture.
And the contract itself uses these specific tools, these clauses, to actually allocate and manage all that risk. We looked at paid shifting payment risk down the chain.
And liquidated damages, setting upfront costs for delays, material escalation clauses dealing with price swings.
Yeah, and we spent some time on indemnity provisions.
Yeah.
Those crucial risk-shifting clauses, and importantly, how wildly their enforceability can change depending on which state's law applies. That was a real eye-opener.
It really highlights the local legal context. Ultimately, these contracts, they're so much more than just paperwork or a formality. They are that essential blueprint. They turn the ideas and handshakes into secured, defined, and legally enforceable commitments.
They protect the money, protect the dreams, by setting out the choreography, the rules of engagement for the deal.
And that's the goal.
So here's maybe a final thought to leave you with. Considering just how much something as basic as whether an indemnity clause works can change dramatically from one state to the next. What does that really tell you about the absolute need to understand the specific legal ground you're standing on and to actually read and understand every single clause in your contract?
Hmm. It's not just about signing, is it?
Not at all. It's about truly understanding the detailed steps, the obligations, and the risks embedded in that choreography before the music starts.